Mike from RedLetterMedia is a damn liar. By now we should all know that his wide amount of assumptions, exaggerations, and misinformation to tear down George Lucas's work led to assholes like Simon Pegg or Chris Stuckman repeating his bullshit. What people don't want to acknowledge about prequel resurgence is that Mike, under his persona of Mr. Plinkett, manufactured a lot of things. He commonly showed out of context clips from X behind the scenes documentary and never accurately described what was actually going on. You go and watch those documentaries for yourself and you realize Mike was full of shit. That, and he also doesn't give any sufficient context. When he was describing A New Hope's opening and how exciting it was compared to The Phantom Menace or whatever, and tried saying that it was George Lucas who probably fought against putting it in the movie.
In fact, this is so genius, I have a feeling that George Lucas had nothing to do with it and probably fought against putting it in the movie.
If this guy actually knew about how A New Hope was made, he'd know that it was George's idea to have A New Hope start that way. It was from George's script, for Christ's sake. What Mike basically did is treat his biased assumptions as fact. Or he lied. A lot of what he says is easily disprovable. In fact, maybe I should make a video someday fact-checking every assumption and implication he made. Because there's a lot. Mike did not just critique the prequels. He also used his critique to vilify George Lucas and discredit him as an artist. And this brings me to the topic of today's video, because Mike is not an exclusive case to any franchise. Literally anyone of any fan base can say whatever they want, especially if a franchise is starting on the internet. If you're able to make that jump, you can say whatever the hell you want, and sometimes you'll be lucky enough to have a big enough following that spews your narrative with not a single person doing their research. A good example of this phenomena is to look at a franchise that you wouldn't typically think could have this, and that's SpongeBob SquarePants. SpongeBob SquarePants is one of the most popular cartoons of the 21st century. Created by the late Steven Hillenburg and premiering on the 1st of May 1999, the titular character has captured the hearts and minds of children all over the world. However, like anything that grows a large following, there'll also be people that may be dissatisfied later on in the franchise's history and tries to complain about whatever. Now with Star Wars, we know that Plinkett and all who followed him complained about the prequels ruining Star Wars as a whole, even though that's easily disprovable. As if we're talking broad terms, Star Wars was actually thriving under George. But it's a similar case replicated with SpongeBob. So, a common narrative spread around SpongeBob is that seasons 4 to 8 of SpongeBob SquarePants, after the release of the first movie in 2004, bastardized the show when it should have never been made, and that the creator Steven Hillenburg and most of the writing staff left after the original movie. This narrative also presents season 9 onwards as the renaissance of the show, and that it saved the show, with Hillenburg and friends returning around the time of the second movie, Sponge Out of Water, in 2015. But as you will soon learn from me, none of this story holds true.
Part 1. The Fake Exodus.
The post-movie SpongeBob narrative is that most of the show's original writers, Hillenburg and friends as we'll call them, left the show after season 3 and the movie. However, none of this is true. Although it is true that Hillenburg took a backseat as a showrunner, just like George Lucas and Star Wars, everything had to go through Hillenburg and earn his stamp of approval. He would read every script and ask for changes or rewrite the storyboards himself, often adding jokes and adjusting them and whatnot. As for the other writers, Paul Tibbitt, for example, who worked on SpongeBob since the very beginning and could pretty much be considered the show's co-creator, became the main showrunner after the movie. Another important writer, Aaron Springer, who was around since season 1, continued working on SpongeBob well into the later seasons. If you want to know how long, it was up until season 8. There was also Zeus Service, who started working on the show in season 2, and continued on into the later seasons, up until season 9. Critics of the show are somewhat right about 2 people who left, but not the exact date. First, there's C.H. Greenblatt, who was an important creative force from the show's conception. He did leave SpongeBob to make Chowder, However, he didn't leave after season 3 and the movie. He left after season 4. With Hillenburg taking a back seat, Greenblatt in particular had more control over the show than he ever did before. The art and writing style is more noticeable than ever in episodes such as Fear of a Krabby Patty and Selling Out. In the latter, he even voiced one of the characters. It is worth noting that he isn't credited as writer or the storyboard guy in Selling Out, but his touch is certainly felt and cannot go unnoticed. His credits can even be seen in Fear of a Krabby Patty, as he got credits as a writer and the storyboard guy. You can notice his art and animation style in Fear of a Krabby Patty, and if you compare it to Chowder, which he created, you can notice the similarities. Lastly, we should talk about Dan Povenmire. While not majorly credited in the opening credits, more so in the end credits, he also worked on the show from 2001 to 2004. He is notable for writing a bunch of the classic songs like the Campfire Song. He did leave around season 4, so that's pretty much the only valid case. He left specifically to go make Phineas and Ferb, which would eventually get on air in 2007. I may have left out a lot of other writers, but these are the main guys.
Part 2, the quality.
Now, even if the critics of post-movie SpongeBob are wrong about the writers, it doesn't necessarily mean they're wrong about the show's decline in quality. However, what does prove the quality is an unbiased assessment of the episodes. There's a bunch of common criticisms of the show that can also be applied to the first 3 seasons, plus the movie. What many pre-movie purists consider the peak of the show. If you've watched Mysterious Mr. Enter, who is one of the most prolific critics of SpongeBob, who most definitely falls into the category of a pre-movie purist, he has videos made around the peak of post-movie SpongeBob hate, which I'd say is around 2013 to 2015. While he has dialed back on his personal hatred of certain writers, and apologized for the time he personally attacked one of them, the point is, his perspective on SpongeBob concerns season 4 being okay, while seasons 5 to 8 are the ones he despised. It seems the pre-movie purists especially hate season 6, and Mr. Enter is no exception. There are valid criticisms to make of certain episodes post-movie, such as the infamous one-course meal, which was about Plankton being harassed by Mr. Krabs into almost committing suicide, and the wasted potential of Atlantis SquarePants, where they got the late David Bowie and never had him sing, among other things. Although the Patchy the Pirate segments are pretty funny. But there's a lot, and I mean a lot of invalid criticisms those like Mr. Enter made. I recall in his older videos, Mr. Enter complained about plot holes, contrivances, and continuity in episodes of SpongeBob he didn't like. Anyone who knows the first thing about SpongeBob is that none of these 3 things matter. SpongeBob is a whimsical world. It's irrelevant. When has SpongeBob ever made sense? There are other critiques, however, that don't automatically come from a blatant misunderstanding of SpongeBob. There is barely anything to criticize in season 4 that are in the other seasons. How to explain the later seasons is that there was an overload of episodes ordered by Nickelodeon executives that led to the writers and general staff who worked on the episodes being overworked. That's why we got episodes like The Splinter, in which SpongeBob gets the titular injury in a graphic display. Back to the infamous one-course meal, that particular episode was too real with its subject matter, with Plankton having a legitimate reason to be afraid, and not a cartoonish one, and tried to kill himself in a real way people try to commit suicide. It's easy without context to say why these writers were fucked, but knowing that they were overworked probably just led to some bad or rushed ideas. Not letting the talent be the talent often results in a mess. Just look at every Star Wars production post-2012. With all that being said, most of the episodes were pretty good. Season 4, in fact, is on par with the original 3 seasons. Although seasons 5 to 8 do have a few stinkers, some of which I just mentioned, but they usually are moderately good to on par with episodes from the original 3 seasons.
Part 3, the character assassination.
To address more specific recurring criticisms, let's talk about the characters as pre-movie purists call them flanderized. To list off the main cast, SpongeBob was bumped up to 11 in how annoying he was. Patrick was either a stupid dumbass or a jerkish smartass. Mr. Krabs is a flat-out greedy business owner, Squidward is the world's depressed punching bag, and Sandy was a scientist and that's it. I'm paraphrasing Mr. Enter here when I say that, but this is neglecting pre-movie episodes. For example, Mr. Krabs being cheap, and that being it, is nothing unique in post-movie SpongeBob. Let's take a look at the Season 2 episode Jellyfish Hunter. In that episode, SpongeBob sells jellyfish jam to Mr. Krabs. But come the climax of the episode, it turns out that Mr. Krabs is abusing the jellyfish on an industrial level just to make him money. This episode literally just has Mr. Krabs be greedy, and the main villain. And this wasn't a one-time occurrence either. What about the Season 3 episode where Mr. Krabs sells SpongeBob's soul for 62 cents? There's also another Season 3 episode, Krabby Land, in which Mr. Krabs literally baits children in with an unsafe, dangerous amusement park with a bare minimum effort put in. Even SpongeBob is distraught over this, and Mr. Krabs receives no sort of redemption in the episode. So it's rather hypocritical talking about Mr. Krabs being only cheap in the post-movie era. I also wanted to talk about Squidward, as he's the most talked about character in regards to the show's changing nature. For starters, Squidward has always been the world's depressed punching bag. The earliest example of him doing nothing wrong, but still receiving torment, was the early Season 1 episode Jellyfishing, which was the 6th episode ever to be broadcast. That episode literally has Squidward just brush SpongeBob and Patrick off in annoyance, but then have an accident, in which he's stuck in a body cast and goes through so much suffering. And it works! Mr. Enter cites what he calls Squidward torture porns as happening in Season 4's Good Neighbors, when that's not true. Squidward is a character meant to be abused, whether he did anything wrong or not. Why? Because he's always miserable, so it makes no difference. I'm not talking smack about the character on an emotional level. I'm just going off the show's original philosophy on Squidward. There were episodes where he deserved his torment, and others where he did not. And they all worked. The notion that the tormentor must be the instrument of their own destruction is just untrue when it comes to SpongeBob. Now you can feel bad for Squidward in these episodes, but you gotta hold the original 3 seasons to the same standard. Also, my co-writer pointed out that Squidward was a big asshole towards the end of Good Neighbors, as he throws SpongeBob and Patrick's apology cake in the garbage, and starts hitting his home security system to do something, which makes the thing go haywire, and so on and so forth. So in regards to SpongeBob, he does admittingly have a higher pitch, but that has more to do with Tom Kenny voicing the character for years and years. Obviously a character isn't going to sound the same if the same person voices them for over 20 years at this point. It's not intentional though. This happens with a lot of cartoon characters voiced by the same person for years upon years. If I had to guess, Tom Kenny was probably getting a deeper voice, and so he decided to compensate by constantly changing the pitch of his voice with SpongeBob. So the most important of which is Patrick Star, and just like Squidward, has maintained the trope of him being a jerkish asshole in the early series. As an example, the Season 2 episode I'm With Stupid, the episode which introduced Patrick's parents in the most awkward way, but the relevant part is that Patrick wants to impress his parents for their visit to his rock home, and SpongeBob suggests he acts dumber than Patrick to improve his image in his parents' eyes. However, this evolves into Patrick forgetting the favour SpongeBob's trying to do for him with next to no transition. Even Mr. Enter in his original list acknowledged this episode, and put it at number 9 on his list. But this isn't the sole example we could use. There's also the Season 2 episode The Secret Box, which concerns a box that Patrick's keeping safe from SpongeBob, and SpongeBob is eager to know what's inside, and is desperate to find out. As it turns out, once Patrick fools SpongeBob into thinking it's just a piece of string, it turns out to be an embarrassing photo of SpongeBob at the Christmas party, and Patrick laughs at it. So yeah, pretty jerkish. Imagine for a minute that this episode released in Season 6. Pre-movie purists would have ripped on it. So Sandy is cited as the least hateable character post-movie, where it's criticized that she's a scientist over her other traits. But it doesn't mean they just ignore everything else like her hobby of karate or her Texan patriotism. Sure, Her sciencey traits were played up more post-movie, starting with the classic Season 4 episode Chimps Ahoy, in which Sandy's inventions are inspected by her bosses for investment reasons. And of course, SpongeBob gets involved and shenanigans happen. It's a pretty good episode. Honestly, I don't see a criticism here, especially since Sandy is like the one character that pre-movie SpongeBob purists seem to at least tolerate.
Part 4. Post-movie analysis.
Season 4 is very much on par with the original 3 seasons, and had many of the same writers, even if Steven Hillenburg took a back seat. Season 5, you see a turnover with Zeus Service and Adam Springer, and Nickelodeon put time crunch on the writers, resulting in a decline in quality. It's more accurate to say that Nickelodeon executives are to blame for any decline fans saw in SpongeBob, and not the exodus of Steven Hillenburg. SpongeBob was turning into a money-milking franchise at this point. Season 7 is reasonably deemed the worst season when it came out. Not without some good episodes, but it was the weakest at the time. Things improved with Season 8. The seasons that put out episodes like It's a SpongeBob Christmas and Hello Bikini Bottom, which even Mr. Enter really liked. Then we get to Season 9, which the first half was the usual. Some good episodes, some mediocre, but the second half was heavily affected by the release of the second SpongeBob movie, in which production on the season was halted to make the movie. It was actually a 3 to 4 year gap between the two halves of the season, so around 2011 to 2015. It is true that Steven Hillenburg returned for the second SpongeBob movie, but after that, he got Lou Gehrig's disease, which forced him to step back immediately. And as we all know, this resulted in him passing away in November of 2018. So his return wasn't as triumphant as he and others had hoped, but pre-movie SpongeBob purists like to act that him returning for the movie is what got the show back on track. And that's just not true. In reality, there was a lot of new blood coming into the show after the second movie. This includes people like Ben Gruber coming on to work on SpongeBob, after working on another show. I'll give you 3 guesses on what it is. Let me give you some clues. It's loud, annoying, and obnoxious. You want to know what it is? Teen Titans Go. Yeah, that's right. One of the most hated shows of its time, seen as inferior to the original cartoon, had one of its writers hop over to SpongeBob, and this caused SpongeBob, along with a whole cast of new writers, to completely change the show forever. The art style and animation, for one, was completely ruined. It became essentially like rubber, and anything sort of like Teen Titans Go. They made the show unwatchable for those familiar with SpongeBob up until that point. It became kindergarten goo that belongs on Nick Jr. and not the main Nickelodeon channel. Mr. Enter ironically put it best. The animation seems more frantic than energetic, and it ruined the slapstick. Any of the character models just looked completely off by a mile. I mean, this is Mr. Krabs in Season 10. And he just looks completely off. It's incredibly noticeable compared to earlier seasons. You might think it might be slight enough to say, who cares? But remember that the characters are animated in a completely off way. Keep in mind, this is what he looks like earlier in the show. We've also got bad episodes like Everything. This is not a joke. Most if not all the episodes suffer from the problems introduced. Mr. Enter might have ripped on Ink Lemonade, for example, but there's a lot more. And you can bet that this is the result of the new writers. The decline of SpongeBob is due to new people working on the show, like Ben Gruber. They clearly don't understand SpongeBob at all. This, like the sequel trilogy, is what actual bad SpongeBob looks like. Now here, I wanted to tie back into the point of this video.
Part 5. Conclusion.
So the goal of this video was to demonstrate that any franchise or intellectual property can have a swarm of misinformation spread about it by people who go with a certain narrative because they want to believe it. Plinkett's claim that George probably wanted to start off A New Hope really boring is easily refutable, but not a lot of people bothered to look at the behind-the-scenes production of the original movie, or the prequels. There will always be a tendency to misrepresent whoever and whatever when people aren't happy. I've previously spoken about those who claim that the prequels ruined the entire Star Wars franchise, and said people have never heard of the following content.
Oh shit, man! Take me by the hand, lead me to the land! Don't you understand? Voice of the corner of the globe is a real trip!
We all know Mike had a lack of experience with the overall Star Wars franchise. Those who are largely invested in everything beyond the movies either liked the prequels or were indifferent to them, because there was plenty of other stuff to hold them over. And I can back that up with my venture into the expanded universe. What Mike said about George Lucas and the prequels were not true, implication or not. But if what he said was true, it would assist the points he was making. I mean, Plinkett even admitted, quote, "These are just my interpretations of the footage. I wasn't there." Now, I'd say someone like Mr. Enter is more of a reverse Plinkett since he used the original creator to advance his narrative. While Mike made George Lucas out to be some incompetent outlier who was never actually that talented, and other people had to do his work for him, and yada yada yada, which isn't true, and you start to notice this narrative literally only applies to Star Wars and Indiana Jones and nothing else. Try convincing a prequel hater to watch THX 1138 or American Graffiti. American Graffiti is a movie directed by George Lucas that doesn't even have a central main character. Instead, it focuses on different perspectives throughout the movie. So Plinkett's point that the Phantom Menace not having a central main character and how it detracts from the movie is just wrong. Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan are the POV characters, and there's clearly a group of protagonists. It doesn't have to be just one. I'm getting off topic, but that's what Plinkett makes you do. Mike was just plain wrong. And he doesn't actually back up what he says with evidence. He's known for just taking random clips out of context and then implies that George done goofed. So the pre-movie SpongeBob purists may be a reverse of Plinkett, but their methods are very similar. They try to justify something they don't like, and thus they spin things out of context. And you can tell that a lot of them even concede that Season 4 was actually decent according to them, which was the first post-movie season. But then they have to make up a story about how Steven Hillenburg leaving meant that SpongeBob wasn't going to last long as a quality show. I also think they kind of forgot what SpongeBob was. It's a cartoon for kids that's not meant to be taken seriously. So Mr. Enter criticizing plot holes and contrivances in a review about SpongeBob instead of stuff that actually matters, like comedic pacing and animation and stuff like that, tells you all you need to know. In a similar vein, prequel haters forget that Star Wars is not the Terminator. It's not supposed to be some dark, gritty war film or whatever. In fact, the original movie was supposed to subvert war movies at the time fresh off of Vietnam by showcasing the heroes of war and a black and white morality and whatnot. Heroic rebels versus an evil empire. Adult themes are not supposed to be found in the main series of films. That's why characters like Jar Jar existed. That's not to say there isn't any hardcore stuff. I mean, Star Wars Republic is pretty brutal, but good luck convincing Plinkett to read anything Star Wars. He prefers Star Trek anyways.
Under the mountain.